Get out of the car. Now. Hands where I can see them. The words cracked through the closed garage like a whip, and Renee Coleman's whole body went still before her mind caught up with what was happening. Red and blue light bled through the narrow gap under the garage door, painting jagged stripes across the concrete floor. Her hands were still on the wheel. Her house key was still in her purse on the passenger seat. She had not even taken off her seatbelt. Rewind 6 hours. At 4:10 that afternoon, Renee Coleman sat in a windowless conference room on the 9th floor of the Department of Justice building in Washington, listening to a briefing about a police department 3 states away that had just been placed under a federal consent decree. She took notes in a cramped, efficient hand, the kind of handwriting that comes from 20 years of court reporters, timing your every word. She was 44 years old. She was the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division. Almost nobody outside that building knew her name, and she preferred it that way. She wore a plain gray blazer that morning, the kind that disappears into a crowd, and low black flats instead of heels, because her right knee had never fully recovered from a car accident 12 years earlier. On her lapel, small enough that most people never noticed it, she wore a thin silver pin shaped like a set of old-fashioned scales. It had belonged to her mother, Alberta Coleman, a woman who spent 31 years cleaning courthouses in Macon, Georgia, and never once set foot inside a courtroom as anything but a janitor. Renee touched that pin every morning before she left the house. She never explained why. Nobody asked. By 9:40 that night, the briefing had run long, the way they always did. And Renee was finally driving home along Ash Grove Lane, a quiet street in the Brookhaven section of Atlanta, lined with 100-year-old oaks and houses that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. She had bought her house 4 years earlier in cash, after a decade of overtime and a modest inheritance from her mother's life insurance. The neighbors were polite in the distant way of people who assume everyone around them belongs. Renee liked the quiet. She liked that nobody there needed anything from her. She turned into her own driveway, thumbed the visor remote, and watched the heavy wooden garage door groan upward. She eased her silver Lexus LS into the garage, the scent of cut grass and engine oil settling around her, and reached over to gather her briefcase from the passenger seat. That was the moment the light exploded behind her. Get out of the car. Hands where I can see them. Renee's pulse spiked, but her training took over before her fear could. She had reviewed hundreds of body camera videos in her career. She had drafted the very policy language some departments now used to define an unlawful stop. She knew with total clinical certainty that a marked patrol car parked at the mouth of her own garage at 9:52 at night, without a warrant, without hot pursuit, and without her having broken a single traffic law, had no lawful basis to be there at all. She also knew that being right and being safe were 2 very different things. She rolled down her window 6 inches, kept both hands visible on the wheel, and spoke in the same measured voice she used to cross-examine hostile witnesses in federal court. "Officer, this is my home. May I ask why you followed me into my own garage?" 2 flashlight beams swung toward her face at once. Behind them, boots crunched on the driveway, heavy and unhurried, the walk of a man who has never once been asked to explain himself. "Whose car is this?" the first officer said. His voice was flat, almost bored, as if he already knew the answer he wanted to hear and was only waiting for her to disappoint him. "It's mine," Renee said. "I just got home from work." The officer's flashlight lowered just enough for her to see his face. He was somewhere in his 40s, thick through the neck and shoulders, with the sun-weathered look of a man who spent 20 years believing his uniform was an argument that ended all others. His name tag read Holloway. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Holloway said. "Officer, I haven't committed a traffic violation," Renee said, careful to keep the tremor out of her voice. I'd like to know what's going on before I get out of my car in my own garage at 10 o'clock at night. Holloway's palm slammed flat against the roof of the Lexus, a sound like a gunshot in the enclosed space. Step out of the car right now, or I will remove you from it. Somewhere behind him, a second, younger officer shifted his weight from foot to foot, his flashlight trembling slightly. His name tag read Parks. He looked, more than anything, like a man who had wandered into a situation he did not fully understand and desperately wished he were somewhere else. Renee moved slowly, telegraphing every gesture the way she had once taught a room full of young prosecutors to do. She unbuckled her seatbelt with one hand. She opened the door with the other. She stepped out into the cool September air in her gray blazer and her low black flats, holding nothing more dangerous than a set of car keys. "Turn around," Holloway ordered. "Hands on the roof." "Officer Holloway," Renee said, reading his name tag deliberately, the way she would read a name into the court record. "My name is Renee Coleman. I own this house. My driver's license and my registration are in my purse, on the passenger seat, if you would allow me to retrieve them. I told you to turn around." Before she could take another breath, his hand closed around her upper arm, fingers digging hard enough to bruise, and he spun her bodily toward the car. Her shoulder struck the doorframe. A gasp of pain and disbelief escaped her before she could stop it. "Do not put your hands on me," she said, and something in her voice dropped an octave, a tone that had once made a state attorney general go quiet mid-sentence in a deposition. It landed on Holloway for exactly 1 second before his ego swallowed it whole. "Are you resisting?" he said. "Are you resisting me right now?" "I am standing perfectly still," Renee said. "You are currently committing battery against a private citizen on her own property." "Sir," the younger officer Parks said quietly, easing around the back of the car. "Sir, maybe we should just. She hasn't done anything." "Parks, watch her hands." Holloway snapped and yanked Renee's arms behind her back. The cold bite of steel closed around her wrists, tight enough to leave marks. The sound of the ratchet clicking shut seemed to echo off every wall of the garage. Across the street, a porch light flicked on. Through lace curtains, an elderly woman in a floral robe stood watching, one hand pressed flat against her own chest. "Walk," Holloway said, gripping Renee's elbow hard enough to steer her stumbling down the driveway toward the curb, toward the flashing lights, toward the small, cold, public humiliation of being marched out of her own home in handcuffs in front of a street full of dark windows, and one lit one. "You are making the worst mistake of your professional life," Renee said, her voice steady, even as her shoulders burned. "And you are about to find out exactly how expensive that mistake is." Holloway laughed, short and ugly. "Yeah," he said. "I've heard that one before." He had no idea. Not yet. But in less than 9 hours, Officer Dale Holloway would understand precisely what kind of mistake he had made, and by the time he understood it fully, there would be no walking it back. Renee Coleman had grown up 900 miles away, in a 2-bedroom house on Fontaine Street in Macon, Georgia. The only child of a widowed mother who worked nights scrubbing the marble floors of the Bibb County Courthouse. As a girl, Renee used to ride the city bus downtown after school and sit in the back row of the courthouse hallway, waiting for her mother's shift to end, watching lawyers in expensive suits walk past her without ever once looking down. She was 7 years old, the first time a bailiff told her to move along. Like she was loitering rather than waiting for her own mother. Her mother, Alberta, never complained about the men in suits who ignored her. She simply worked. She scrubbed floors until they shone bright enough to reflect the courtroom seal, and every night on the bus ride home she'd told her daughter the same thing. "One day, baby, you're going to walk through those doors, and they are going to have to call you ma'am." Alberta Coleman died of a stroke 14 years later, 6 months before Renee finished her law degree at Emory University, and never got to see her daughter sworn into the Georgia bar let alone watch her argue a landmark civil rights case in front of the 11th Circuit. The small silver pin on Renee's lapel had been her mother's, a $5 costume brooch bought at a discount store decades earlier, the only piece of jewelry Alberta Coleman had ever owned that wasn't a gift from someone else. Renee wore it to every deposition, every hearing, every long night in a windowless office. It was not decoration. It was a promise she renewed every single morning. She thought of her mother now, standing on the cold curb in handcuffs, her shoulders frustrated, despite the pain radiating down both arms, refusing to sit on the wet concrete no matter how many times Holloway barked at her to do it. Officer Parks left to guard her while his partner ran her plates, shifted uncomfortably, and finally spoke, his voice low enough that Holloway couldn't hear. "Ma'am," he said, "if you'd just tell us whose house this is, we could clear this up." "I've told you 3 times," Renee said. "It's mine." "What's your badge number, Officer Parks?" 4412, he said automatically, then seemed to regret it. "And Holloway's?" 2299, he muttered before catching himself. "Look, we're not trying to. There's been break-ins around here, high-end cars, a whole ring of them. And you match—" "I match a description," Renee said, "or I match your assumptions. Because those are very different things, officer, and only one of them is legal." Parks had no answer for that. He looked at his boots instead. The same way boys look at the ground when they know. Somewhere underneath the training and the uniform and the years of being told they were the good guys, that something has gone deeply wrong and they are standing too close to it to stop it. The radio in the cruiser crackled. "Unit 16, dispatch, come in." Holloway leaned into the open driver's door and grabbed the mic. "Go ahead." Returning information on Georgia Plate Romeo Foxtrot 831. Vehicle is a Lexus LS, registered to Renee A. Coleman. No wants, no warrants, registration current. Address on file, 114 Ashgrove Lane. A pause hung in the night air, thick enough to taste. Parks looked at the brass numbers on the mailbox at the end of the driveway, 114. He looked at Renee. He looked at the house behind her, the manicured hedges, the porch light, the address that matched, word for word, digit for digit, everything she had told them from the very first second. "Holloway," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "it's her house, it's her car. It matches." Holloway climbed out of the cruiser slowly, and for the briefest moment, something like doubt crossed his face. It didn't last. Men who have never once been made to answer for anything do not surrender their certainty easily. They simply look for a new place to stand. "Doesn't prove she didn't steal it," Holloway said. "Could have stolen the identity, too. People do it." Even Parks flinched at that. "Come on, man, just take the cuffs off." "Not until I see a physical ID that matches her face," Holloway snapped, and before Renee could tell him not to, he was already inside the garage, wrenching open the passenger door of her Lexus and pawing through her purse. "Do not go through my belongings," Renee called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. But Holloway was already walking back toward her, flipping open her wallet, holding her driver's license up to his flashlight. He looked at the photo. He looked at her face. He looked back at the photo. "Renee Coleman," he read aloud, some of the swagger draining out of his voice. "Now, look behind it," Renee said quietly. "There's a second card back there. I'd suggest you look at it very carefully before you say another word." Holloway's thumb slid behind the plastic license, and a small silver and gold federal credential badge caught the beam of his own flashlight. He went very still. The cricket song in the yard seemed to stop. The porch light across the street flickered as the elderly woman in the robe leaned closer to her window, still watching everything. "Deputy Assistant Attorney General," Holloway read, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Civil Rights Division." For 3 full seconds, nobody on that driveway moved. "Officer Parks," Renee said, still standing perfectly straight, despite the cuffs biting into her wrists. I'd like you to radio your watch commander. Tell them to come to 114 Ash Grove Lane immediately, and tell them to bring whatever paperwork they have for filing a formal notice of civil liability. Because tomorrow morning, this department is going to need it." The wail of a second siren split the quiet street 11 minutes later. A dark SUV screeched to a stop behind the patrol car, and Captain Frank Delgado, a heavy-set man in his late 50s with 30 years on the force, and 8 months left until retirement, stepped out, already looking like a man walking into a burning building he could smell but not yet see. "What in God's name is going on here?" Delgado barked, striding up the driveway. "Holloway. Parks. Report." Holloway's explanation came out in a rushed, defensive tangle about a car theft ring, about a woman who wouldn't cooperate, about officer safety. Delgado listened with his jaw tightening, and then his eyes landed on Renee, standing motionless in handcuffs on her own front walk, the porch light framing her like a photograph that would end careers. "Cap," Holloway said finally, his voice dropping. "It's her house, and she's DOJ. Civil rights." Delgado closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, the way a man does when he already knows the shape of the disaster and is only waiting for someone to confirm the details. Then he crossed the driveway himself, reached for the handcuff key, and spoke in a voice suddenly stripped of every ounce of authority it had carried a moment earlier. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Frank Delgado. I am deeply sorry for what has happened here tonight. Please, let me remove these." Renee turned, presenting her wrists, and did not flinch as the cuffs clicked open. She did not rub them furiously. She simply turned them slowly under the porch light, so that Delgado could see, clearly and without excuse, the deep red bands already forming on her skin. "Captain Delgado," she said, "are you familiar with the federal statute governing deprivation of rights under color of law?" "I am," he said quietly. "Then you understand exactly what your officer did here tonight." Renee said, "He followed me onto private property without cause, physically assaulted me, searched my vehicle without a warrant, and detained me without probable cause, all while informing me, loudly, in front of my neighbors, that I, quote, didn't look like I belonged on this street." Delgado turned toward Holloway, and whatever remained of his patience evaporated. "Is that true?" "That's not." Holloway started, and then, watching the captain's face, seemed to understand that the truth was no longer optional. It wasn't like that exactly. She was uncooperative. She made a sudden move toward the car. I thought she might be reaching for a weapon. Renee's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes went cold and very, very still. "A sudden move," she repeated, "toward a weapon." "That's a serious allegation, Officer Holloway. Are you certain you want to put that in an official statement?" "I know what I saw," Holloway said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Then, let's check your body camera footage," Renee said simply. Holloway's hand drifted to the small black device, clipped to his chest, and Renee watched the exact moment his face changed. The moment a lie he had been telling himself for the last 20 minutes ran headlong into a fact he could no longer control. "Camera wasn't recording," he said. "Must not have activated when You turned it off," Delgado said, his voice low and furious. "You turned off your body camera before detaining a civilian in her own driveway." "It was an accident," Cap Holloway said, but nobody on that lawn believed him, least of all himself. Renee reached into her blazer pocket and withdrew her phone, the screen glowing softly in the dark. "Officer Holloway," she said, "because of the nature of my work, prosecuting police misconduct and organized criminal enterprises for the federal government, the United States Marshals Service requires certain security measures at my residence. There are 4 fixed cameras covering this property, 1 inside the garage, 1 above the front door, 1 in the hedge line, 1 covering the driveway. None of them run on batteries. None of them can be switched off from outside. All of them record continuously, and all of them upload automatically to a secured federal server the moment they capture activity. She turned the phone screen toward Delgado. Holloway's own voice played back into the night air, tinny but unmistakable. "You don't look like you belong on this street." The sound of his palm slamming the car roof you followed. Then the scuffle. Then the click of the handcuffs. Delgado stared at the phone like it might bite him. "By 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," Renee said, sliding the phone back into her pocket. "This footage will be on my supervisor's desk at the Department of Justice. By 10, my personal attorney will file a federal civil rights complaint naming Officer Holloway, this department, and this city. And by noon, the Civil Rights Division will have opened a formal pattern and practice investigation into every stop this precinct has made in the last 5 years." She looked directly at Holloway, and her voice dropped to something quieter, and somehow far more frightening than shouting would have been. "You wanted to know if I belonged on this street, Officer Holloway. I do. And by the time this is finished, I am going to own a very large piece of your department's future." The next morning at 7:40, Renee Coleman walked through the marble lobby of the Department of Justice building on Pennsylvania Avenue, having not slept a single hour. Beneath the crisp cuffs of a fresh white blouse, dark bruises ringed both her wrists, but her stride was even and unhurried, the walk of someone who had already decided exactly how the next 6 months of her life would go. By 8:15, she sat in a secure conference room on the 5th floor with Deputy Attorney General Martin Reyes and Special Agent Robert Ainsley of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, watching her own garage footage play across an 80-inch monitor. Reyes, a man who had spent 3 decades in that building and thought he had seen every ugly shade of American law enforcement, took off his reading glasses halfway through the video and did not put them back on. "I've reviewed a lot of profiling cases in this job," Reyes said quietly when the video ended. "I don't think I've seen one this arrogant. In your own driveway. Under the guise of an investigation." "It's worse than arrogance," Renee said, sliding a thick folder across the table. "I spent the night pulling Officer Dale Holloway's internal affairs file. 38 complaints in 9 years. Excessive force, unlawful stops, verbal abuse. 11 of them from Black or Hispanic residents in this exact neighborhood. Every single complaint was cleared. Internal Affairs called it, and I'm quoting directly, insufficient corroborating evidence." Ainsley, who had been silent through most of the briefing, leaned forward and turned his tablet toward the group, revealing a map dense with colored pins scattered across the wealthy suburbs north of Atlanta. "There's something you're missing," he said. "Something bigger than one bad cop." He explained it slowly, deliberately, the way a man lays out a case he has been building for months and finally has the missing piece for. For the last 11 months, the Bureau's organized theft task force had been tracking a sophisticated luxury vehicle ring operating across 3 counties, cars vanishing from driveways in the middle of the night, stripped for parts or shipped overseas within 48 hours, with an uncanny, almost impossible ability to avoid every patrol car in the area. We pulled GPS logs for every unit in Holloway's precinct. "Going back 6 months, Ainsley said, tapping the tablet. "Every single theft happened 2 to 3 miles from wherever Holloway and Parks were making a big, loud, visible stop. Every time." The pieces assembled themselves in Renee's mind with a cold, sickening clarity. "They weren't hunting the thieves," she said. "They were the distraction. Pull over a Black resident in a nice car, make it loud, make it slow, keep dispatch and the whole street watching for 30 minutes, while the real theft happens 3 blocks over." "Precisely," Ainsley said. "Racial profiling wasn't the point. It was the cover." Renee sat back slowly, feeling something shift and settle inside her, the old grief of every unanswered complaint in that file folding itself into something sharper, something with a use. "I want full federal authorization," she said. "Conspiracy against rights, deprivation of rights under color of law, and I want it tied directly to a racketeering charge for the theft ring. This isn't a bad apple. It's a business model wearing a badge. Reyes studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, firmly. You have it. Agent Ainsley, assemble your team. I want warrants ready by this afternoon. At 2 o'clock that same day, the officers of the Brookhaven precinct were going about an ordinary shift, unaware that a convoy of black FBI vehicles was already 3 minutes away. Captain Delgado sat in his office, drafting an incident report he hoped might somehow soften what was coming. He had suspended Holloway that morning. He believed in the small self-protective way that men in his position often do. That suspension might be enough. It was not. The glass doors of the precinct opened, and 24 federal agents in raid jackets moved through the lobby with quiet, terrifying efficiency. Special Agent Ainsley led them. Beside him, wearing a plain navy coat that hid the marks on her wrists, walked Renee Coleman. This precinct is executing a federal search warrant, Ainsley announced, his voice carrying across the sudden, frozen silence of the bullpen. Step away from your terminals. Leave your phones on your desks. Captain Delgado emerged from his office already pale, already understanding that whatever he had hoped to contain the night before had grown far larger than one officer's bad judgment. Miss Coleman, he started. We suspended him. We're handling. You are being relieved of command, Renee said. Not unkindly, but without hesitation either. Effective immediately. Agent Ainsley is taking custody of your dispatch logs, your GPS records, and every internal affairs file for the last decade. The back doors opened, and 2 agents walked in, escorting a man in handcuffs, still in a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants, having been pulled from his own home 20 minutes earlier. Dale Holloway looked nothing like the man who had slammed his palm against Renee's car the night before. His eyes were hollow. His hands shook. As the agents marched him through the bullpen past his own colleagues, his eyes found Renee's, and for one long, unbearable moment, neither of them looked away. I didn't know who you were, Holloway said, his voice cracking. That was never the point, Renee said quietly. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me like a human being. You needed to treat everyone that way. That was the job. You just decided it wasn't yours. He had nothing to say to that. The agents led him out through the same doors he had walked through every day for 9 years. And this time, none of his colleagues met his eyes. 6 months later, in a federal courtroom in downtown Atlanta, Dale Holloway stood at the defense table in a rumpled suit that had once belonged to a version of himself he no longer recognized. His attorney had advised him, repeatedly, to say as little as possible. When the judge asked if he wished to make a statement before sentencing, Holloway stood anyway, his hands trembling at his sides. I told myself I was protecting the neighborhood, he said, his voice barely audible in the silent courtroom. I told myself it for 9 years. I never once asked myself why every single person I stopped without cause happened to look like Miss Coleman. I know why now. I was never protecting anyone. I was just protecting my own comfort, and I let a badge convince me that made it right. He turned briefly toward the gallery where Renee sat in the 3rd row. Her hands folded in her lap, the small silver pin catching the courtroom light. I'm sorry, he said. It doesn't fix what I did. It was not absolution. Renee did not offer him a nod or a smile or any gesture of forgiveness. But she believed, watching him, that for the first time in 9 years, Dale Holloway had actually heard himself. The judge sentenced him to 14 years for conspiracy against rights and racketeering. Officer Parks, who had cooperated fully with investigators and testified against his former partner, avoided prison but was permanently barred from serving in law enforcement anywhere in the state. Captain Delgado retired into disgrace 2 months before his pension vested, forfeiting nearly all of it. The Brookhaven Police Department was placed under a sweeping federal consent decree with mandatory body camera protocols that could not be disabled, an independent civilian review board with full subpoena power, and a complete overhaul of how traffic and pedestrian stops were documented and reviewed. Nearly a year after that night in her garage, Renee Coleman drove home along Ashgrove Lane, a little past 10 in the evening. The same hour, the same quiet street, the oaks now bare with the coming winter. She pressed the visor remote. The garage door rose without incident. She pulled inside, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the settling quiet, the scent of cut grass long gone, replaced by the clean, cold smell of the season. No lights, no sirens, no voice through a loudspeaker demanding she explain her own existence in her own home. She stepped out of the car, touched the small silver pin at her lapel out of habit more than necessity, and walked into her house without once looking over her shoulder. She had carried the worst that a badge and a stranger's assumptions could throw at her, and she had turned it, deliberately and completely, into something that protected people who would never know her name. Justice, she had come to understand, was not only the thing she argued for in courtrooms, it was also this: the quiet, the unremarkable, ordinary safety of walking into your own home and knowing finally that no one was waiting to decide whether you belonged there. If this story moved you, not because of how it ended, but because somewhere in it you recognize someone you know, or maybe recognized yourself, take a moment to like this video so it can reach someone who needs to hear it. Share it with anyone who's ever been made to prove they belonged somewhere they already did. And leave a comment below. Have you ever stood in Renee's place, or in the silence of someone who watched and said nothing? I read every single one.